Case 1, Christie Michelle Scott. Russellville, Colbert County, Alabama. September 6, 2008. The first 911 call came in at 6:37 in the morning. Flames were shooting from the windows of a modest home on a quiet Russellville street, and neighbors could hear screaming. Christie Michelle Scott, a 35-year-old mother, stood outside her burning house, hysterical, telling first responders that her 6-year-old autistic son, Mason Scott, was trapped inside. Firefighters rushed into the inferno, battling intense heat and thick smoke, desperately searching for the little boy. When they found Mason, it was already too late. The child's body was recovered from his bedroom, and the medical examiner would later determine that he had died from smoke inhalation and thermal injuries. The community of Russellville, a small city of fewer than 10,000 people, immediately rallied around Christie Scott, viewing her as a grieving mother who had suffered the unimaginable loss of her special needs child in a terrible accident. But fire investigators noticed something disturbing at the scene. The burn patterns didn't match what they would expect from an accidental fire. Accelerant detection, dogs alerted to multiple locations throughout the house, suggesting that gasoline or another flammable liquid had been deliberately poured and ignited. The fire had started in multiple places simultaneously, a telltale sign of arson. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a financial motive that turned their suspicions toward Christie herself. Just months before the fire, she had taken out an $87,000 life insurance policy on Mason. For a single mother struggling financially, this was a significant sum. Interviews with family members revealed that Christie had been under considerable financial stress and had complained about the challenges of raising an autistic child who required constant care and attention. The investigation revealed even more disturbing details. Christie had researched fire-starting methods online. She had purchased gasoline in containers just days before the fire. And most damning of all, she had made sure she was safely outside the house before the flames consumed her son's bedroom, while making it appear that she had barely escaped herself. In November of 2009, Christie Michelle Scott was arrested and charged with capital murder. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They presented evidence of the insurance policy, the internet searches, the gasoline purchases, and the expert testimony of fire investigators who conclusively determined the fire had been intentionally set. The defense argued that Christie was a devoted mother who would never harm her child, but the evidence was overwhelming. On August 5, 2010, a Colbert County jury found Christie Michelle Scott guilty of capital murder. The jury recommended the death penalty, and Judge Dan Bushong sentenced her to death by lethal injection. Christie became one of only 2 women on Alabama's death row at that time, and she remains there today, maintaining her innocence despite exhausting numerous appeals. Mason Scott never had the chance to grow up, to overcome his challenges, or to experience the unconditional love a mother is supposed to provide. Instead, he died terrified and alone, betrayed by the one person who should have protected him above all others. His case stands as a stark reminder that evil can wear the mask of motherhood, and that financial desperation can extinguish even the most basic human empathy. If you believe cases like Mason's deserve justice and public awareness, leave a comment below with your thoughts. Hit that like button to help this video reach others who need to hear these stories, and subscribe to Cold Case Hour for more verified true crime documentaries that honor victims by telling their stories with integrity. Case 2, Blessence Pearl. Gadsden, Etowah County, Alabama. October 30, 2016. 1-year-old Blessence Pearl should have been celebrating her first Halloween weekend, perhaps dressed in a tiny costume, experiencing the wonder of fall festivities. Instead, her tiny body was discovered in the most bizarre and horrifying location imaginable, inside a funeral home hearse parked at Collier Butler Funeral Home in Gadsden, Alabama. The discovery was made on that October afternoon when an employee of the funeral home went to move the hearse and found the infant's lifeless body inside. The immediate questions were overwhelming. How did a baby end up inside a funeral home vehicle? Who was she? And most troubling of all, how did she die? Law enforcement immediately launched an investigation, and through fingerprint identification and missing persons reports, they identified the child as Blessence Pearl. Her mother, 23-year-old Terica Pearl, had reported her daughter missing earlier, but her story had been inconsistent and suspicious from the beginning. When investigators brought Terica in for questioning, her account of events kept changing, and crucial details didn't align with the physical evidence. The autopsy would reveal the heartbreaking truth: Blessence had died from asphyxiation. The medical examiner determined that the manner of death was homicide, not accident. This tiny girl had been deliberately suffocated, and the evidence pointed directly to the person who should have been her primary protector, her own mother. As the investigation unfolded, a disturbing picture emerged. Terica Pearl had been struggling with substance abuse issues and had a turbulent living situation. Multiple witnesses reported seeing her behaving erratically in the days before Blessence's death. The relationship between Terica and her daughter had been troubled, with family members expressing concerns about the baby's welfare. The bizarre location where Blessence's body was found, inside a funeral home hearse, added another layer of disturbing questions to the case. Investigators had to piece together how the child ended up there, and why. The details revealed during the investigation suggested a chaotic and desperate attempt to conceal the crime, with Terica allegedly placing her daughter's body in the hearse in a panic after the child died. In December of 2016, Terica Pearl was arrested and charged with murder in connection with her daughter's death. The Etowah County community was shocked and devastated. Gadsden, a small city where everyone seems connected, rallied around the memory of little Blessence, holding vigils and demanding justice for a baby who never had the chance to say her first words or take her first steps. The legal proceedings that followed were complex and emotionally wrenching. Terica's defense team argued that she was suffering from mental health issues and substance abuse problems that had impaired her judgment. However, the prosecution maintained that, regardless of her personal struggles, she had made a conscious choice to harm her child and then attempted to hide the evidence of her crime. The case eventually resulted in a conviction, with Terica Pearl being held accountable for the death of her daughter. The Etowah County court system processed the case with the gravity it deserved, ensuring that Blessence Pearl's short life wasn't forgotten and that justice was served in her name. Blessence's case highlights the tragic intersection of substance abuse, mental illness, and maternal responsibility. It raises uncomfortable questions about the support systems available for struggling mothers and about how society can better protect vulnerable children. But above all, it stands as a testament to a little girl whose name, Blessence, ironically means blessing, yet who never received the blessing of a mother's love and protection. The story of Blessence Pearl demands that we never look away from these difficult cases. If this investigation has impacted you, show your support by liking this video and leaving a comment about how we can better protect vulnerable children. Subscribe to Cold Case Hour for more verified true crime cases that shine a light on injustice. Case 3, Kamarie, Holland. Phenix City, Russell County, Alabama. December 13, 2021. 5-year-old Kamarie Holland loved to dance. Her smile could light up a room, and she had the kind of infectious joy that made everyone around her feel happier. She lived in Columbus, Georgia with family members, but she would occasionally visit her mother, 31-year-old Christie Marie Sipple, who lived just across the state line in Phenix City, Alabama. December 13, 2021, was supposed to be one of those visits. Instead, it became the day that Kamarie's young life ended in the most horrific way imaginable. The investigation began when Kamarie was reported missing by her grandmother in Columbus. Law enforcement on both sides of the state line immediately launched a frantic search for the kindergartner. The Amber Alert system was activated, and the communities of Columbus and Phenix City mobilized to find the missing child. But the search would end in the worst possible way when Kamarie's body was discovered at an abandoned house in Phenix City. The autopsy revealed injuries so severe and disturbing that even seasoned investigators were shaken. Kamarie had been sexually assaulted and murdered. The forensic evidence told a story of unimaginable suffering endured by a child who should have been opening Christmas presents and playing with friends, not fighting for her life against predators. As investigators worked to piece together Kamarie's final hours, they uncovered a conspiracy that shocked even hardened law enforcement professionals. The evidence led them to 37-year-old Jeremy Tremaine Williams, a registered sex offender from Arizona who had traveled to Alabama. But Williams hadn't acted alone or at random. He had allegedly been given access to Kamarie by her own mother. The investigation revealed text messages and communications between Christie Sipple and Williams that suggested she had, incomprehensibly, facilitated contact between this known sexual predator and her own daughter. According to court documents and law enforcement statements, Christie had allegedly received money in exchange for providing Williams with access to Kamarie. The details were so disturbing that prosecutors described it as one of the most egregious cases of parental betrayal they had ever encountered. Christie Marie Sipple was arrested and charged with multiple felonies, including human trafficking and capital murder. Jeremy Williams was also arrested and charged with capital murder, kidnapping, and sodomy. Both faced the possibility of the death penalty for their alleged roles in Kamarie's death. The case sent shockwaves through the tight-knit communities along the Alabama-Georgia border. Vigils were held in Kamarie's memory, with community members struggling to comprehend how a mother could betray her own child so completely. Pink balloons, Kamarie's favorite color, were released into the sky as hundreds of people gathered to honor a little girl whose life had been stolen. In subsequent legal proceedings, Christie Sipple entered a guilty plea to multiple charges, including facilitation of murder and human trafficking of a child. In exchange for her cooperation and guilty plea, prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty. In June of 2022, she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Russell County Circuit Judge Benjamin Lewis handed down the sentence in a courtroom packed with family members, some weeping openly as they addressed Christie directly, asking how she could have done this to her own child. Jeremy Williams proceeded to trial and was convicted of capital murder and other charges. In March of 2023, a Russell County jury recommended the death penalty, and Judge Lewis sentenced Williams to death for Kamarie's murder. The case of Kamarie Holland represents perhaps the most profound betrayal of maternal duty imaginable. A mother is biologically and socially positioned as the primary protector of her child, yet Christie Sipple allegedly transformed herself into the facilitator of her daughter's abuse and murder. The case has led to discussions about child protection systems, about how registered sex offenders are monitored, and about the warning signs that might have prevented this tragedy. Kamarie's father, mother, and extended family have established foundations and awareness campaigns in her name, working to prevent other children from suffering similar fates. Her story has become a rallying point for child advocacy organizations throughout Alabama and Georgia, ensuring that her short life continues to have meaning and impact. Kamarie Holland's case reminds us why this work matters. If you want to see more cases that hold perpetrators accountable and honor victims, please hit the like button and leave a comment. Subscribe to Cold Case Hour to stay informed about verified true crime cases that demand justice. Case 4, Escambia County Infant. Escambia County, Alabama. July 28, 2019. The call came into 911 dispatchers in the early morning hours of July 28, 2019. A 2-month-old baby wasn't breathing at a residence in rural Escambia County, Alabama. Emergency medical personnel rushed to the scene, but despite their best efforts, the infant could not be saved. The tiny child was pronounced dead shortly after arrival at the hospital. Initial reports suggested that the baby had fallen or suffered an accidental injury, but when doctors examined the infant's body, they found injuries inconsistent with the reported circumstances. The medical team discovered severe head trauma, injuries that could not have been caused by a simple fall or accident. The fracture patterns and internal injuries indicated that significant force had been applied to this 2-month-old child's head. This wasn't an accident. This was abuse. Law enforcement was immediately notified, and the Escambia County Sheriff's Office launched a homicide investigation. Detectives focused their attention on the people who had been caring for the infant in the hours before the child's death. 2 suspects emerged: 22-year-old Cheyenne Comelander, the baby's mother, and her stepfather, whose name has been partially withheld from some public records due to the ongoing nature of certain aspects of the case. Through interviews and forensic analysis, investigators built a timeline of the infant's final hours. The baby had been in the care of both Cheyenne and her stepfather on the day of the death. Medical examiners determined that the head trauma was inflicted during that timeframe, and both caregivers had opportunities to harm the child. The question became, who delivered the fatal blows, and what did the other person know? Alabama law enforcement takes child abuse cases with extreme seriousness, and the Escambia County investigators were thorough and relentless. They consulted with pediatric forensic specialists, reviewed medical records, and conducted extensive interviews with family members, neighbors, and anyone who had contact with the family. The evidence suggested that the home environment had been chaotic and potentially dangerous for the vulnerable infant. Cheyenne Comelander was arrested and charged with murder and aggravated child abuse. Her stepfather was also arrested and charged with the same offenses. Prosecutors alleged that one or both of them had inflicted the fatal injuries on the 2-month-old baby, and that even if only one person delivered the blows, the other was culpable for failing to protect the child and for potentially participating in covering up the abuse. The case proceeded through the Alabama court system, with both defendants facing the possibility of life in prison if convicted. The legal strategy for both defense teams attempted to shift blame to the other defendant, creating a complex prosecutorial challenge. However, the physical evidence and medical testimony were clear. This baby had been violently assaulted in the home, and the only people with access and opportunity were the 2 defendants. Escambia County, a rural area in the southwestern corner of Alabama, was deeply affected by the case. The small community struggled to understand how a mother, a young woman who had carried this child for 9 months and given birth just weeks earlier, could harm or allow harm to come to her own baby. The case highlighted the tragic reality that infanticide and child abuse often occur in homes where outsiders see no warning signs, where the violence happens behind closed doors and the victims have no voice to cry for help. The legal proceedings included emotional testimony from medical examiners who described the extent of the infant's injuries, from law enforcement officers who detailed the investigation, and from family members who struggled to reconcile the person they knew with the acts that had been committed. The courtroom atmosphere was heavy with grief and anger as the community sought justice for a baby who never had the chance to speak a word or take a step. Ultimately, both Cheyenne Comelander and her stepfather were held accountable through the judicial process, with convictions or plea agreements that ensured they would be incarcerated for their roles in the infant's death. The exact sentences and current status remain part of the ongoing Alabama correctional system, but the community received the assurance that the perpetrators would not be free to harm other children. This case represents the most vulnerable category of victims, infants who are completely dependent on their caregivers for every aspect of survival. When those caregivers become abusers, the betrayal is absolute, and the result is often fatal. The Escambia County case serves as a reminder that child protection requires vigilance from entire communities, not just from the parents and relatives who are supposed to provide care. Cases involving infant victims are among the most difficult to report, but they're also among the most important. If this coverage matters to you, please like this video and comment below. Subscribe to Cold Case Hour for verified true crime documentaries that never shy away from seeking justice. Case 5, Wendy Bailey. Fayette County, Alabama. Date of offenses, multiple dates in 2018. Indictment, February 2021. Caleb Collins should have been a normal little boy growing up in rural Fayette County, Alabama. He should have been going to school, playing with friends, and experiencing the simple joys of childhood. But Caleb vanished from public view, and what investigators eventually uncovered was one of the most disturbing cases of child abuse and maternal neglect in Alabama history. Wendy Bailey, Caleb's mother, lived with her family in a home that neighbors described as isolated and troubled. For months, possibly years, no one outside the immediate family had seen Caleb. Teachers didn't report him missing because he had never been enrolled in school. Child Protective Services had limited contact with the family, and the red flags that might have saved this child were never raised high enough or fast enough to trigger intervention. When law enforcement finally became involved in early 2021, they began asking questions that Wendy Bailey couldn't or wouldn't answer satisfactorily. Where was Caleb? When had anyone last seen him? Why were there no medical records, school records, or any documentation of this child's existence for such an extended period? As investigators dug deeper, a horrifying picture emerged. According to the evidence gathered by the Fayette County Sheriff's Office and presented to a grand jury, Caleb had been subjected to systematic abuse and neglect. The details that emerged during the investigation suggested that this child had suffered for an extended period, enduring conditions that no human being, let alone a child, should ever experience. In February of 2021, a Fayette County grand jury handed down a multi-count indictment against Wendy Bailey. The charges were severe and comprehensive: aggravated child abuse, domestic violence by strangulation, and abuse of a corpse. The final charge, abuse of a corpse, carried the darkest implication. Caleb Collins was deceased, and his mother was accused of mishandling his remains in a way that demonstrated not just neglect, but active desecration of her own child's body. The investigation revealed that other people in the household had witnessed Caleb's decline and either participated in the abuse or failed to report it. The case expanded to include potential charges against other family members, creating a web of accountability and complicity that extended beyond just Wendy Bailey. Fayette County, a sparsely populated area in northwest Alabama, was shaken by the revelations. The case raised troubling questions about how a child could disappear so completely from society's radar. Caleb had never attended school, so no teacher raised an alarm. He apparently never received regular medical care, so no doctor documented injuries or failure to thrive. He was isolated from extended family and community connections that might have noticed something was wrong. Child advocacy organizations used Caleb's case as an example of why greater oversight and intervention are necessary for homeschooled children and for families that withdraw from community engagement. The case prompted discussions about mandatory wellness checks, about the balance between parental rights and child protection, and about the systems that failed to save Caleb before it was too late. The legal proceedings against Wendy Bailey proceeded through the Alabama court system, with prosecutors methodically building a case based on forensic evidence, witness testimony, and the documented absence of a child who should have been alive and thriving. The challenge for prosecutors was that, without a body recovered or full cooperation from witnesses, they had to construct a circumstantial case that was nonetheless powerful enough to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Wendy Bailey had committed these horrific acts. Defense attorneys faced the difficult task of representing a woman accused of systematically abusing and potentially killing her own son, then disposing of his body in a way that suggested consciousness of guilt. The constitutional requirement that every defendant receive vigorous representation meant that Wendy Bailey's legal team had to challenge the prosecution's evidence and timeline, but the weight of evidence was substantial. Throughout the legal process, one question haunted everyone involved. Where was Caleb? If he was deceased, where were his remains? The abuse of corpse charge suggested that law enforcement had evidence that Caleb was dead and that his body had been mishandled, but the specific location of the child's remains has been part of the ongoing investigation and legal strategy. Wendy Bailey's case represents a particular category of maternal filicide that involves not just a moment of violence, but systematic, prolonged abuse that effectively erases a child from existence. Caleb Collins was never photographed on social media, never celebrated with birthday parties, never acknowledged as the living, breathing human being he was. His mother allegedly transformed him from a person into a secret, and ultimately into a victim who disappeared completely. Caleb Collins deserves to be remembered, and cases like his deserve thorough investigation and public awareness. If you agree, hit the like button and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Subscribe to Cold Case Hour for more verified true crime coverage that holds perpetrators accountable. Case 6, Nancy Margaret Johnson. Semmes, Mobile County, Alabama. January 3, 2021. The quiet community of Semmes, Alabama, about 15 miles north of Mobile, woke up to tragedy on the morning of January 3, 2021. At a modest home on Saddlehorn Drive, law enforcement responded to a wellness check that would uncover a scene of devastating loss. Inside the home, they found 35-year-old Nancy Margaret Johnson deceased, along with her two young children, 7-year-old Adriana Johnson and 5-year-old Jonathan Johnson. The initial investigation revealed that all three family members had drowned in the bathtub. The circumstances immediately suggested this was not a tragic accident, but rather a murder-suicide in which Nancy had killed her two children before taking her own life. The Mobile County Sheriff's Office and Coroner's Office worked to reconstruct the events of that terrible night, interviewing family members, examining the scene, and trying to understand what could drive a mother to such an irreversible act. Friends and family members described Nancy as a devoted mother who loved her children deeply, but who had been struggling with significant mental health challenges. Those who knew her well reported that she had been showing signs of severe depression and had been experiencing what some described as a mental health crisis in the weeks leading up to the tragedy. The COVID-19 pandemic had created additional stressors for the family, including isolation, economic uncertainty, and disruption to normal support systems. According to investigators, Nancy had been in a state of psychological distress that may have involved thoughts of persecution or overwhelming despair about the future. In this tragically distorted mental state, she may have believed she was protecting her children from some perceived threat or suffering by ending their lives and her own. This phenomenon, known as altruistic filicide in psychiatric literature, occurs when a parent kills their children out of a delusional belief that death is preferable to the suffering the children might otherwise endure. The case was ultimately ruled a murder-suicide by the Mobile County coroner, with Nancy determined to be the perpetrator. The methodology, drowning in the family's bathtub, suggested a degree of planning and deliberation, as drowning requires sustained effort and time, particularly with two children. The horror of those final moments, as the children likely struggled and their mother held them underwater, is almost too painful to contemplate. The community of Semmes struggled to process the loss. Vigils were held for Adriana and Jonathan, with neighbors and classmates gathering to remember two children whose lives were cut short not by accident or illness, but by the very person who had brought them into the world. Teachers at their school described them as bright, happy children who showed no outward signs of the crisis unfolding in their home. The case sparked important conversations about maternal mental health, about the resources available to struggling mothers, and about the warning signs that family and friends should watch for. Several aspects of Nancy's situation were common among parents who harmed their children during mental health crises: social isolation, lack of adequate mental health treatment, overwhelming stress, and a possible underlying psychiatric condition that may have gone undiagnosed or inadequately treated. Family members who spoke to media outlets expressed devastating guilt, wondering if they had missed signs, if they should have intervened more forcefully, if there was something, anything, they could have done to prevent the tragedy. The reality is that mental health crises can escalate rapidly and unpredictably, and even with support systems in place, some individuals become so mentally ill that they pose dangers to themselves and others. Unlike many of the other cases in this documentary, Nancy Johnson's actions appear to have stemmed from severe mental illness rather than from financial greed, anger, or callous indifference. This doesn't diminish the tragedy or the loss of two innocent children, but it does place the case in a different category of filicide. Nancy wasn't seeking insurance money or freedom from parental responsibility. She was apparently suffering from a psychiatric crisis so severe that she couldn't distinguish between protecting her children and destroying them. The aftermath of the Semmes murder-suicide included increased attention to mental health resources in Mobile County, with advocacy groups pushing for better screening for maternal depression, improved access to psychiatric care, and more robust intervention protocols for families in crisis. Alabama, like many states, struggles with limited mental health resources, particularly in rural and semi-rural areas like Semmes. The Johnson family tragedy highlighted the deadly consequences of these gaps in the healthcare system. For Adriana and Jonathan Johnson, the world held promise and possibility. They were at the beginning of their lives, with so much potential waiting to be realized. But their mother's mental illness transformed their safe home into the site of their deaths, and the woman who should have been their protector became their executioner. The case serves as a stark reminder that untreated mental illness can be deadly, and that maternal love alone is not sufficient to overcome severe psychiatric disorders. Mental health awareness is crucial for preventing tragedies like this. If this case has affected you, please like this video and share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to Cold Case Hour for more true crime coverage that examines not just the crimes, but the factors that contribute to these tragedies. Case 7. Jamesia Brichae Pruitt. Lanett, Chambers County, Alabama. August 14, 2023. 4-month-old Nehemiah Pruitt should have been reaching his first milestones, rolling over, recognizing faces, responding to sounds. Instead, on August 14, 2023, emergency responders were called to a residence in Lanett, Alabama, where they found the infant unresponsive. Despite the efforts of paramedics and emergency room physicians, Nehemiah was pronounced dead at the hospital. The initial report indicated that the baby had experienced some kind of medical emergency, but when doctors examined Nehemiah's small body, they found injuries that raised immediate red flags. The infant had sustained trauma that couldn't be explained by natural illness or accident. The medical team notified law enforcement, and the Lanett Police Department launched an investigation into what they now suspected was a homicide. Lanett, a small city straddling the Alabama-Georgia border with a population of fewer than 7,000 people, was shocked by the news. The Chambers County community is tight-knit, the kind of place where everyone seems to know everyone else, and the death of a baby, particularly under suspicious circumstances, sent ripples of grief and anger throughout the region. Investigators focused their attention on 22-year-old Jamesia Brichae Pruitt, Nehemiah's mother. In the hours following the baby's death, Jamesia's statements to police raised concerns. Her account of what happened was inconsistent with the medical evidence, and forensic pathologists determined that the injuries Nehemiah sustained were consistent with abusive head trauma, what used to be commonly called shaken baby syndrome. Abusive head trauma occurs when an infant or small child is violently shaken, causing the brain to impact against the inside of the skull. The acceleration-deceleration forces can cause bleeding in the brain, retinal hemorrhages, and other catastrophic injuries. Because infants have weak neck muscles and disproportionately large and heavy heads, they are particularly vulnerable to this type of abuse. The condition is often fatal, and survivors frequently suffer permanent neurological damage. On August 15, 2023, just one day after Nehemiah's death, the Lanett Police Department arrested Jamesia Pruitt and charged her with murder. The swift action reflected the strength of evidence that investigators had already gathered, including the medical examiner's preliminary findings and Jamesia's own statements that allegedly contained inconsistencies and admissions. As the case moved forward, prosecutors awaited the final autopsy report, which would provide definitive conclusions about the cause and manner of Nehemiah's death. The investigation was ongoing, with authorities gathering additional evidence, interviewing witnesses, and building a comprehensive case against Jamesia Pruitt. The community's response was a mixture of grief and outrage. Vigils were held for baby Nehemiah, with community members lighting candles and saying prayers for a child who had barely begun his life. Local churches organized support for the extended family members who were mourning the loss, and child advocacy groups used the case as an opportunity to educate the public about the dangers of shaking infants and the importance of recognizing signs of frustration and seeking help before reaching a breaking point. Infant crying is one of the most common triggers for abusive head trauma. Babies cry as their primary means of communication, and when caregivers are sleep-deprived, stressed, or lacking adequate support, the persistent crying can trigger frustration and anger. Organizations like the National Center on Shaken Baby Syndrome emphasize that it's okay to put a crying baby down in a safe place and walk away to regain composure, but it's never acceptable to shake or strike an infant. Jamesia Pruitt's case highlighted these issues. As a young mother with a 4-month-old infant, she may have been experiencing the overwhelming challenges that many new parents face. The sleepless nights, the constant demands, the isolation that can come with caring for a newborn, all of these factors can contribute to caregiver stress. However, the vast majority of parents experiencing these stressors never harm their children. The question in cases like this is, what pushes someone from frustration to fatal violence? As the legal process unfolded, Jamesia Pruitt remained in custody at the Chambers County Detention Facility, awaiting trial on the murder charge. If convicted, she faced decades in prison or potentially life without parole. The prosecution's case would rely heavily on the forensic medical evidence, on statements Jamesia made to investigators, and on expert testimony about the nature of the injuries Nehemiah sustained. For the extended Pruitt family, the case created an impossible emotional situation. They were mourning the loss of a beautiful baby boy while simultaneously grappling with the reality that his own mother was accused of causing his death. This kind of intrafamilial violence creates fractures in family systems that can never fully heal, with relatives forced to choose sides and to reconcile their love for both victim and accused perpetrator. Nehemiah Pruitt's death represents the particular vulnerability of infants, who are completely dependent on their caregivers and have no ability to defend themselves or escape dangerous situations. At 4 months old, Nehemiah couldn't crawl away, couldn't tell anyone what was happening, couldn't protect himself in any way. His mother had complete power over his welfare, and according to the charges, she allegedly abused that power with fatal consequences. Baby Nehemiah's case reminds us that the most vulnerable among us need our protection and advocacy. If this story matters to you, please hit that like button and leave a comment. Subscribe to Cold Case Hour for continued coverage of verified true crime cases that demand accountability. Case 8 Elizabeth Case. Limestone County, Alabama. September 2, 2016. September 2, 2016 should have been a normal late summer day for the Case family in Limestone County, Alabama. But by the end of that day, 16-month-old Waylon Case would be dead, and his mother, Elizabeth Case, would be facing capital murder charges in one of the most controversial hot car death cases in Alabama history. The facts of what happened that day are straightforward in their tragic simplicity. Waylon Case was left alone in a vehicle for an extended period while temperatures outside reached into the 90s. Inside the closed vehicle, temperatures would have quickly climbed well above 100 degrees, creating an environment that was rapidly fatal to the toddler. When Waylon was finally discovered and removed from the vehicle, it was far too late. The child had succumbed to hypothermia, deadly overheating. Hot car deaths are tragically common in the United States, claiming the lives of approximately 40 children each year. However, not all hot car deaths result in criminal charges. The legal system distinguishes between true accidents, where a parent genuinely forgets a child is in the vehicle due to a disrupted routine, and cases where negligence or recklessness rises to the level of criminal conduct. In Elizabeth Case's situation, prosecutors determined that the circumstances went beyond a simple, tragic mistake. According to the indictment handed down by a Limestone County grand jury, there were aggravating factors that elevated this from an accident to a crime. The investigation suggested that Elizabeth may have been aware that Waylon was in the vehicle, but failed to take action to remove him from the dangerous situation. Adding complexity and controversy to the case was the revelation that Child Protective Services had been involved with the Case family before Waylon's death. Records indicated that there had been reports of neglect and concerns about the children's welfare. CPS had investigated these reports, but the agency had not removed the children from the home, determining that the situation didn't meet the threshold for removal. After Waylon's death, questions arose about whether CPS should have intervened more aggressively. Could this tragedy have been prevented if the children had been placed in protective custody? Were there warning signs that were missed or dismissed? The case became a flashpoint for debates about the child welfare system in Alabama, about the balance between keeping families together and protecting children from harm, and about the accountability of the agencies charged with child protection. Elizabeth Case was indicted on capital murder charges, a decision that reflected the prosecution's belief that her actions demonstrated such extreme negligence or recklessness that they warranted the most serious criminal charges available under Alabama law. Capital murder charges in cases involving children typically require proof that the defendant's conduct showed depraved indifference to human life, or that the death occurred during the commission of another felony, such as child abuse. The legal proceedings that followed were contentious and emotionally charged. Elizabeth's defense attorneys argued that this was a tragic accident committed by a mother who was overwhelmed and struggling, not a calculated act of murder. They presented evidence of Elizabeth's mental health challenges, her difficult personal circumstances, and the lack of any apparent motive to harm her child. The defense contended that capital murder charges were excessive and vindictive, more about public outrage than about justice. Prosecutors, however, painted a different picture. They presented evidence suggesting a pattern of neglect, documented interactions with Child Protective Services, and circumstances on the day of Waylon's death that suggested Elizabeth's conduct went beyond mere forgetfulness. The state's case relied on establishing that Elizabeth either intentionally left Waylon in the car knowing the danger, or that she acted with such reckless disregard for his safety that the result was effectively the same as intentional murder. The Limestone County community was divided. Some residents expressed sympathy for Elizabeth, viewing her as a struggling mother who made a terrible mistake and was now being subjected to excessive punishment. Others, particularly child advocates, insisted that Waylon's death could and should have been prevented, and that accountability was necessary to protect other children and to send a message that parental negligence resulting in death would not be tolerated. The case went through multiple legal proceedings, including preliminary hearings, grand jury presentations, and pretrial motions. The defense challenged various aspects of the prosecution's case, including the sufficiency of evidence to support capital murder charges and the admissibility of certain testimony regarding the CPS history. The prosecution methodically built its case, consulting with medical experts on hyperthermia, with child welfare specialists, and with investigators who had documented the scene and circumstances of Waylon's death. As the case progressed through the judicial system, it continued to generate media attention and public debate. Local and national news outlets covered the story, often framing it within broader discussions about hot car deaths, about parental responsibility, and about the criminal justice system's response to deaths that occur in the context of family dysfunction and neglect. For Waylon Case, a 16-month-old toddler who was just beginning to explore the world, to form words, and to develop his personality, the end came in terrifying isolation inside an overheated vehicle. Pediatric experts who study hot car deaths describe the process as agonizing. As body temperature rises, children experience extreme discomfort, confusion, and eventually seizures and loss of consciousness before death. The suffering is immense, and for Waylon there was no rescue, no relief, no escape. The case of Elizabeth Case raises profound questions about the line between criminal conduct and tragic accident, about the role of systemic failures in child deaths, and about how the justice system should respond when a parent's negligence results in a child's death. Unlike cases involving active violence or clear premeditation, hot car deaths exist in a gray area where intent is ambiguous and where societal responses range from compassion to condemnation. For the child welfare system in Alabama, Waylon's death prompted internal reviews and policy discussions. If CPS had been involved with the family and had documented concerns about neglect, why weren't more protective measures put in place? The answers were complex, involving questions of limited resources, the legal standards required for removing children from homes, and the challenge of predicting which troubled families will escalate to tragic outcomes. Elizabeth Case's prosecution proceeded through the Limestone County courts, with the ultimate resolution of the case determining whether she would spend the rest of her life in prison for capital murder, or whether the charges would be reduced to lesser offenses that reflected a different understanding of culpability and intent. Regardless of the legal outcome, the reality remained unchanged. Waylon Case was dead, and the systems and people who should have protected him had failed. Cases like Waylon's remind us that child protection requires vigilance from parents, communities, and institutions. If you believe this story needs to be told, please like this video and comment with your thoughts on how we can better protect vulnerable children. Subscribe to Cold Case Hour for more verified true crime documentaries. Case 9, Rhonda Belle Martin. Montgomery, Montgomery County, Alabama. Crimes committed, 1944 through 1951. Executed, October 11, 1957. We now turn to a historical case that remains one of the most chilling in Alabama's criminal history. Rhonda Belle Martin was a serial poisoner who operated for 7 years in the mid-20th century, murdering multiple family members including 5 of her 7 children. Her crimes were methodical, cold-blooded, and motivated by a combination of financial gain and a disturbing psychological need to control life and death. Rhonda Belle Martin was born in the early 1900s and lived what appeared from the outside to be a normal life in Montgomery, Alabama. She married, had children, and maintained the appearance of a respectable housewife and mother. But behind closed doors, Rhonda was methodically poisoning her family members, watching them suffer and die, then collecting life insurance money and moving on to her next victim. Her weapon of choice was rat poison containing arsenic, readily available in that era for pest control. Arsenic poisoning causes terrible suffering. Victims experience severe abdominal pain, vomiting, diarrhea, and eventually multi-organ failure. Death can take days or weeks, during which the victim experiences agonizing symptoms that were often attributed to natural illness in an era before sophisticated toxicology testing. Between 1944 and 1951, Rhonda systematically poisoned members of her family. Her victims included 5 of her 7 children, 2 husbands, her mother, and possibly others. Each death was initially attributed to natural causes or to mysterious illnesses that doctors of the era couldn't adequately explain. Rhonda played the role of grieving mother and widow perfectly, collecting sympathy from neighbors and friends while secretly planning her next murder. The pattern finally came to light in 1951 when Rhonda made a critical mistake. After poisoning her 5th husband, she mentioned to acquaintances that she had given him something that would fix him. Suspicious family members contacted authorities, and for the first time, investigators began to look closely at the pattern of deaths surrounding Rhonda Belle Martin. When police exhumed the bodies of Rhonda's victims, toxicology tests revealed high levels of arsenic in their remains. The evidence was overwhelming and damning. Rhonda had been systematically murdering her family members for 7 years, and the true scope of her crimes was only now coming to light. Rhonda was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder. During interrogation, she eventually confessed to the poisonings, though her explanations for why she committed these horrible acts were inadequate and unconvincing. She claimed financial motives in some cases, but investigators believed there was also a psychological component, a need for control, attention, or perhaps satisfaction from the act of murder itself. The trial of Rhonda Belle Martin was sensational for its time. A woman, a mother, systematically poisoning her own children was almost incomprehensible to the public. The courtroom was packed with spectators eager to see the poisoned widow of Montgomery face justice. The evidence presented by prosecutors was methodical and overwhelming. Testimony from medical examiners about the arsenic levels found in the victims, witnesses who testified about Rhonda's suspicious behavior around the times of the deaths, and financial records showing the insurance policies she had collected. The defense had little to work with. Rhonda's confessions were detailed and corroborated by physical evidence. Her attorneys attempted to argue diminished capacity or mental illness, suggesting that no sane person could commit such acts against their own children. However, the prosecution successfully demonstrated that Rhonda had acted with clear premeditation and planning, purchasing the poison, administering it methodically, and collecting insurance money afterward, all behaviors consistent with a calculating criminal, not someone operating under the influence of mental disease or defect. In 1956, Rhonda Belle Martin was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. Alabama's method of execution at that time was the electric chair, located at Kilby Prison in Montgomery. Appeals were filed but ultimately rejected, and on October 11, 1957, Rhonda Belle Martin was executed for her crimes. She was one of relatively few women executed in Alabama, and her case remains one of the most notorious in the state's history. The children Rhonda murdered, victims whose names included Imogen, Carolyn Sue, and others, never had the chance to grow up, to have families of their own, to live full lives. They trusted their mother completely, as children do, never suspecting that the woman who had given them life was also planning to take it away. They ate the food she prepared, not knowing it was laced with poison. They suffered through their final illnesses while their mother watched, pretending to care while actually ensuring their deaths. Rhonda Belle Martin's case predated modern understanding of serial killers and familial murderers. Today, criminologists would likely categorize her as an angel of death-type killer, someone who murders people under their care, often through poison or other covert means, while maintaining an external appearance of being a caregiver. Some experts would also note elements of Munchausen syndrome by proxy, where a caregiver harms those in their care to generate attention and sympathy. The historical nature of this case doesn't diminish its horror. In fact, the 7-year span during which Rhonda operated without detection highlights how much more vulnerable children were in that era. There were no centralized databases tracking suspicious deaths, no sophisticated toxicology testing routinely performed, and a general cultural assumption that mothers were inherently protective of their children. Rhonda exploited all of these blind spots to become one of Alabama's most prolific serial killers. Her execution in 1957 brought closure to one of the darkest chapters in Montgomery's history, but it couldn't undo the tremendous harm she had caused or bring back the innocent children and family members she had murdered for insurance money and whatever psychological satisfaction she derived from her crimes. Historical cases like Rhonda Belle Martin's remind us that evil has existed in every era and that the work of justice never ends. If you found this historical perspective valuable, please hit the like button and leave a comment. Subscribe to Cold Case Hour for more verified true crime cases spanning Alabama's history. Case 10, Evelyn Leyva Etress. Blount County, Alabama. March 10, 2024. We conclude with one of the most recent cases on our list, a tragedy that occurred in the spring of 2024 in Blount County, Alabama. On March 10th of that year, emergency responders rushed to a residence in response to a report that a child had been shot. When first responders arrived at the scene, they found 2-year-old Azariah Etress with a fatal gunshot wound. Despite immediate medical attention, the toddler could not be saved. The initial investigation revealed that Azariah had been shot inside the family home, but the circumstances surrounding how a 2-year-old came into contact with a loaded firearm raised immediate red flags for investigators. The Blount County Sheriff's Office began a thorough examination of the scene, interviewing family members and piecing together the events that led to this preventable tragedy. 26-year-old Evelyn Leyva Etress, Azariah's mother, was present in the home at the time of the shooting. As investigators gathered evidence and conducted interviews, they determined that Evelyn's actions and failures had directly contributed to her son's death. The investigation revealed a pattern of negligence and recklessness that went beyond a simple accident. According to court documents and law enforcement statements, firearms in the home had been left unsecured and accessible to small children. Azariah, at just 2 years old, had no understanding of the danger posed by guns. Like any toddler, he was naturally curious and likely saw the firearm as just another object to explore. But unlike toys or household items, a loaded gun in the hands of a toddler is immediately and catastrophically dangerous. The ballistics and forensic evidence suggested that Azariah had accessed the unsecured firearm and that the weapon had discharged, causing the fatal injury. The specific mechanics of how a 2-year-old could manipulate a firearm became a key part of the investigation. Firearms experts testified that many modern handguns have relatively light trigger pulls that even a small child could inadvertently activate. The tragedy underscored the critical importance of proper firearm storage, using gun safes, trigger locks, and keeping ammunition separate from weapons. But the investigation revealed more than just the failure to secure a firearm. Evidence suggested that the conditions in the home had been unsafe in multiple ways, and that Evelyn had demonstrated a pattern of neglect and inadequate supervision. The totality of the circumstances led prosecutors to conclude that Evelyn's conduct rose to the level of criminal culpability. In the aftermath of Azariah's death, Evelyn Leyva Etress was arrested and charged with reckless manslaughter and aggravated child abuse. The reckless manslaughter charge reflected the prosecution's theory that while Evelyn may not have intended for her son to die, her reckless disregard for his safety and her failure to take basic precautions had caused his death. The aggravated child abuse charge addressed the broader pattern of neglect and endangerment. The Blount County community was devastated by the loss. 2-year-old Azariah was described by family members as a happy, energetic little boy who loved to play and explore. Photos shared by relatives showed a beautiful child with a bright smile and curious eyes, a child who should have been beginning preschool in a year or two, who should have been experiencing the wonder of childhood, who should have had decades of life ahead of him. Instead, Azariah's life ended in an instant because the adults responsible for his safety had failed him. The case became a rallying point for gun safety advocates who emphasized that firearms in homes with children must be stored securely, with ammunition kept separately, and that parents have a legal and moral obligation to ensure that children cannot access weapons. Statistics from the Children's Defense Fund and similar organizations show that hundreds of children die each year in accidental shootings in the United States, and thousands more are injured. Many of these tragedies occur when children find unsecured firearms in their own homes or in the homes of relatives and friends. Alabama, like many states, has laws regarding child access to firearms, but enforcement can be inconsistent and often occurs only after a tragedy has already happened. Evelyn Etress's prosecution proceeded through the Blount County court system, with prosecutors seeking to hold her accountable not just for the immediate circumstances of Azariah's death, but for the pattern of neglect that had made such a tragedy possible. The defense faced the challenge of representing a grieving mother who had lost her child in horrific circumstances, but who was also accused of causing that loss through her own negligence. For the extended Etress family, the case created profound grief and division. Some family members defended Evelyn, arguing that she was suffering enough with the loss of her son and that criminal charges were excessive. Others maintained that accountability was necessary, that Azariah's death had been preventable, and that justice required acknowledging the failures that led to his death. The broader community discussion prompted by Azariah's case focused on child safety, on gun ownership responsibilities, and on the need for better education about securing firearms in homes with children. Blount County, a largely rural area where gun ownership is common and culturally normalized, had to grapple with the reality that constitutional rights to bear arms come with corresponding responsibilities to store those arms safely. As Evelyn Leyva Etress's case moved toward resolution, whether through trial or plea agreement, the fundamental truth remained. 2-year-old Azariah Etress was dead, killed by a danger that should never have been accessible to him. His mother, who should have been his primary protector, had allegedly failed to provide even the most basic safety precautions, and that failure had cost Azariah his life. The case serves as a tragic reminder that parental responsibility includes anticipating and preventing foreseeable dangers. A loaded firearm accessible to a toddler is not an unforeseeable accident waiting to happen. It's a preventable tragedy that requires only basic safety measures to avoid. Evelyn's alleged failure to take those measures transformed her from mother to defendant, and transformed her son from a living child into a cautionary tale. Azariah's death was preventable, and his story must be told to prevent future tragedies. If you believe gun safety awareness saves lives, please like this video and comment below. Subscribe to Cold Case Hour for more verified true crime coverage that advocates for child safety and accountability.